Hey guys, welcome back to Alpha. My name's Nick, and I'm so glad that you're back with us. Last week, we dove into a really important question, and the question was, is there anything more to life than this? We talked about how there's this happiness bucket that we all have, and it's kind of hard to keep that thing full for an extended period of time. And we talked about how Jesus claimed that he is the bread of life, that he's the one that can satisfy that inner longing in our souls. He also claimed to be the way and the truth and the life. And it's really great that Jesus can claim those things, but anybody can claim those things. So today, we should ask another big question. What does the evidence say about who Jesus really is? Now, for me, when I was growing up, I took a little bit of time to actually come around to looking at the evidence of whether Jesus actually was who he claimed to be. See, I grew up in church, but I sort of went to church because my parents made me. I was sort of a Christian by force, right? And it wasn't until I was about 13 years old that I discovered that, oh, there's a different way of doing Christianity. There's a way to do it where it's not boring. There's a way to do Christianity where it actually makes a difference in your life. And I even made some good friends along the way. But there was always this thing in the back of my mind that was wondering, is this actually true? Am I believing something that actually happened, or is it just sort of a nice thing that some people believe? Is it just sort of like it's the most popular religion in the world, so am I just going along with the crowd? Or is there some substance to this? Now, when I was in college, I knew that I needed more than just some blind leap of faith or just because everybody else believed it. I needed to actually see a good reason if I was going to give my whole life to following this man named Jesus. I needed to see that he was more than just a cool guy from 2,000 years ago. But for the years that were before college and searching through all of the evidence, the thing that really sort of opened my mind to could this man Jesus be more than just a man was just thinking about how famous that he was. See, there's lots of different reasons that someone can be famous. Maybe they're famous because of how many people know their name. Maybe they're famous because they have so many people following them on Instagram or on TikTok or on Twitter or wherever it is. There's lots of reasons that people get famous for really awesome things, really important things, really dumb things. People get famous and known for so many different reasons. Well, I want you to think about this. Jesus is arguably the most famous person in all of human history. Think about this. Who else in our world is so famous that their name is used as a curse word? Oh, Justin Bieber, Chloe, Kim, and Courtney! Oh, Taylor Swift had her. So get this. History is even divided based on the life of Jesus. Until very recently, scholarship always used BC and AD to divide up time. BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, which means the year of our Lord, the year that Jesus was born. He has more books written about him, more paintings painted of him. He has more songs sung about and to him than really any other person in human history. Time magazine said that Jesus Christ is the most significant person in human history. I mean, can you imagine how many Instagram followers Jesus would have today? Okay, so let's get the conversation going. Jesus is really famous, he's pretty well known, but my question for you and for the people around you is, what would you want to be famous for? Go ahead and talk with those around you. Ask them that question. What would you want to be known for in a big, big way? Go. All right, so maybe you're wondering, well, why are we spending so much time talking about Jesus and looking at Jesus? There's lots of really famous religious figures. Why look at him? And maybe you're thinking that thing that your mama once told you, just because everybody else thinks it's a great idea does not mean it's a good idea. And your mama's right. But even your mama, when she's on Amazon and is going to buy something, she's looking at things like how many reviews did it get and how good were the reviews. And why? Because all of those things we put together as pieces of evidence to decide, is it actually worth trying it? See, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is the centerpiece of the Christian faith. And really that means that if Jesus actually rose from the dead, that's evidence that God not only exists, but that God should be understood through the lens of Jesus, that he should be seen through the lens of Jesus. In fact, the Bible even says, if Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead, we're just a bunch of pitiful religious people. But if he did rise from the dead, well, then that changes everything. Okay, I want to look at some evidence together. So to do that, we're going to go break into Pastor Richard's office because he's the smartest guy that I know. He just got his doctorate. He's brilliant. And I don't know, maybe there's just some evidence in his office. Ready? Let's go. Now, I've come to believe that there's actually a lot of historical evidence. It's something I had to look into for myself. And when I did, I realized that historical evidence, it is evidence. There's scientific evidence, which is really, really great, but there's historical evidence too. And when you think about it, like a lawyer presents historical evidence in a case. And so every jury that's going to make a decision, they're taking this piece of evidence and this account of what happened, and they're piecing it together to make a decision about what's true. And so we have to do the same thing with Jesus. It's kind of like a jury is taking a step of faith, and it's kind of like we too, as we come to decide who is Jesus. Well, that's a step of faith too. All right, so who is Jesus, and is there any evidence when it comes to his historical life, death, and resurrection? All right, this is Pastor Richard's office. Look at the books. There's so many of them. Do you think he really read them all? Probably not, but maybe he did. He's actually probably that smart. But anyway, when you look at all of this literature, when you look at everything that's been written, and again, remember, we already talked about how hey Richard, we already talked about how Jesus has so many books that are written about him, and there's so much scholarship digging into trying to figure out, did Jesus actually exist? Well, here's the thing. No historian, no serious historian, whether Christian or not Christian, would say Jesus did not live in the Middle East in the first century. That's accepted. That's something that we have lots of evidence for. There's actually a historian named Josephus from the first century. Have you ever heard of Josephus, Richard?
Oh, Joe? Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
Joe, of course. You know Joe. And so Joe, he was not a Christian, but he said that Jesus, he was a good man. He was a guide, he was a teacher, and he was a doer of wonderful works. And there's many other first century historians that their writings are not in the scriptures, the New Testament of the Bible, but they're just outside of the New Testament and reference his life. I mean, look at all of this. Do you really think that that book looks like okay, there's notes in it. All right, thanks for letting us use your office, Richard. Let's go. It's crazy to think that there is more writing about Jesus from the first century, more literature from the first century about him than there is about Tiberius Caesar. And Caesar was the guy that ruled the whole known world at the time. Here's where we get most of our evidence and information from. There's lots of evidence and information about Jesus that comes from outside of the New Testament. But we also get so much detail about his life and what he did and what he said from within the New Testament writings. Now, what is the New Testament? The New Testament is a large portion of the Bible. There's the first 2/3 is the Old Testament. Those are the Jewish scriptures that were written before Jesus was born. And then the New Testament is about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and then a bunch of letters to the Christians that were living out their faith after Jesus had died and risen from the dead. There were 4 writings in particular that were a gathering of eyewitness accounts. Imagine it's like News Channel 5 and News Channel 8 and News Channel 13 and News Channel 17. They all show up on the scene and they're all getting eyewitness accounts and reporting on the same story just from slightly different angles. And those accounts became known as the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they're named those things because those are the names of the authors who penned them, who gathered that information for those accounts. And so when we look into those accounts, we can see, well, what did Jesus say about himself? And what did he do? And what about this whole resurrection thing? Okay, but before we do that, the New Testament was written a long time ago. So how can we know that what we have today and what we're reading about Jesus today is the same as what was written down by eyewitnesses? Well, there's a way to actually know all about that, and it's through a science called textual criticism. This is something I had to study in seminary, and I actually want to toss things over to our friends over at Alpha USA.
Okay, so textual criticism works by comparing ancient manuscripts to discover the original wording. Basically, the more copies of a manuscript there are, and the closer they are to the date of the original manuscript, the more confident we can be. For example, Herodotus and Thucydides were ancient historians who wrote in the 5th century BC. Now, the earliest copies we have of their writings are from around 900 AD, so there's more than a 1300-year gap, and we only have 8 copies of their writings. Yet no classical scholar would doubt that these writings have come down to us in a form that's true to their original copies.
And this is the case with many other ancient works as well. For example, Livy's Roman History, 900-year gap with 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic War, 950-year gap with 9 to 10 copies. And Tacitus, 1,000-year gap with just 20 copies. And then we come to the New Testament, and what we see here is that the time gap is significantly shorter. It was written between 40 to 100 AD, and the earliest manuscript was written as early as 130 AD. And there are 5,309 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin, and 9,300 others, making the New Testament totally unique amongst other ancient books.
So there's lots of evidence that there was the man, Jesus, walking around and living his life in Israel 2,000 years ago. Very few serious historians debate that. But the thing that gets debated all the time is, was he more than a man? And so how could we find out if he's more than a man? Well, one of the ways to do that is to look at, what did he say about himself? See, Jesus said that he was the Son of God. He formed his identity around being divine and human at the same time. That is a massive claim. And anyone that makes a claim like that, well, it should be tested. Jesus said that he is the way and the truth and the life. See, where other religious leaders, they would say things like, this is the way to live your life. Jesus said, I'm the way. Where other religious leaders, they would say, here's the truth that you should believe. He would say, I'm the truth. Here's the way to have a full life. Jesus would say, I am the life. And so Jesus, he stands apart in that way. See, we all have different anxieties and fears and stress and pain that we carry in our life. And Jesus says, come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. These are massive claims that really only God could make. See, at the center of Christianity is this idea of forgiveness. And many times throughout the accounts of Jesus' life, he would go around and he would tell people, your sins are forgiven. And the religious leaders of the day, they were so frustrated. One, because if Jesus was forgiving sins, they weren't coming and making sacrifices at the temple, so they didn't get business. But the other reason was, who can forgive sins but God? See, everybody knew what Jesus was saying about himself when he was forgiving sins. In fact, there was one time when he was actually claiming to be God, and everybody wanted to throw rocks at him until he was dead. And so Jesus, before they could throw rocks at him to stone him, Jesus said, so which of my Father's works are you wanting to stone me for? And they said, we're not stoning you for good works, we're stoning you because you claim to be God, but you're just a man. See, Jesus, he's either a liar, a lunatic, or he is who he says that he is. So if I was going to be famous, I always wanted to be a rock star. I grew up playing guitar. That's actually how I started to fall in love with Jesus, is that I encountered him through worship music at first. And before I started really diving into the evidence, that's where it started for me and my heart started to open up. But I also had this dream of being on a stage in front of everybody, and one of my favorite bands has always been U2, because the guitar sound is just so awesome. I realize most of you might be like, U2? I've never heard of that band. That's because they have been a band since before you were born and before I was born. They've been a band for a long time, one of the biggest bands in the world, by the way. They're still making chart-topping records these days. I remember seeing this interview with Bono, who's the lead singer of U2, and he was being asked by the interviewer, because Bono's a Christian, you know, Jesus, obviously he's famous, obviously he's a good man, obviously he's made a big difference, but Son of God? I mean, that's a little bit of an overstatement, right? So here's what Bono replied to that person interviewing him. He said, "I don't think that you're let off easily by saying he was a great thinker or philosopher, because actually he went around saying that he was the Messiah. That's why he was crucified. He was crucified because he said he was the Son of God. So either, in my view," Bono said, "he was the Son of God or he was nuts. I find it hard to accept that whole millions and millions of lives, half the earth for 2,000 years have been touched, have felt their lives touched and inspired by some nutter. I just don't believe it," he said. Why do you think that Jesus is so famous? So another piece of evidence that we can look at to know, is there anything to what Jesus is saying about himself, is what did he actually do in his life? Well, the accounts of Jesus' life include things like him turning water into wine. It includes him healing people. It includes him doing all of these different miraculous things. He lived this life that was miraculous, and thousands, literally thousands of people would flock to see him and to be healed and to be fed and all of these things. It was more than just a magic show. They all had deep significance tied to every single thing that he did. More than that, Jesus is teaching things like love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemy, or things that like the golden rule, the thing that maybe you always heard growing up, even if you never grew up in church, is to treat others the way that you would hope to be treated, right? This is from the teaching of Jesus. And you might hear that and think, okay, well, that's not that revolutionary. I've heard that before. There's other people that say things like that. That might be true today. But did you know back then, that was utterly revolutionary. It was not at all in alignment with the philosophical and societal teachings of the day to love your enemies. It was taught to hate your enemies. It was taught to be stronger than your enemies. And yet, Jesus said things like, "Blessed are the meek, for they'll inherit the earth." And he turned everything upside down. He has the power to divinely heal, but he also cares for those that are broken, the social outcasts. He was always found with those whom others would assume that God had deemed to be unlovable. See, Time magazine said that Jesus was the most consistent symbol of peace and love and purity in all of Western civilization. Jesus, the life that he lived, it pointed to the fact that maybe, just maybe, he was more than a man. So while our primary evidence comes from the New Testament about the life of Jesus, we also can see lots of references to Jesus in the Old Testament. See, the Old Testament was written hundreds of years before Jesus was even born, but think about this. How many people do you know that have had a whole collection of books that were written about them before they were even born? Well, Jesus, he was fulfilling so many different things that came from the Old Testament, written hundreds of years before he was born. And these are things that he didn't really have control over, things like where he was born, or things like how he would die, or where he would be buried. These are things that he had no human control over whatsoever. And yet these eyewitness accounts, they all agreed, and they all were saying how he was fulfilling prophecy after prophecy. And there's so many of them. See, some people are like, oh, well, he fulfilled a couple prophecies. Couldn't he have just, read the Old Testament and then said, I'm going to set out to trick everyone, and I'm going to just check them off my little to-do list? But the thing is, there were so many of them. One time he fulfilled, I think it was like 29 of them in one day. There's this big story that's culminating in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But the thing is that Jesus, even though he was fulfilling all of these prophecies, which would be a very difficult thing for a normal person to do, he was not liked by the religious and political leaders of the time. They were threatened by his popularity, and what they did is they basically set up the sham of a trial where Jesus was accused of being an enemy of Rome, and he was put before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. And Pontius Pilate interrogated him, and he said he found no fault with him at all. Well, the crowd was in so much of an uproar, and the religious leaders had put so much pressure on the Roman governor that he gave in, and he actually turned Jesus over to his soldiers, and they crucified him, they tortured him, they flogged him, and of course it ended with him being put on a cross with nails through his hands and his feet, and he died between two other criminals that were being crucified that day. And the thing is, everybody at that point thought the story of Jesus was over. But all the accounts, the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life, say that the story goes on from there. The last piece of evidence that I want to talk about with you is the evidence for how Jesus actually did rise from the dead. And I wanted to bring you into our prayer garden here at our church. And here in this prayer garden, we have these bricks, these memorial bricks, where people will have a name of someone who has died that they want to remember, that they want people to know that they've been a part of this church and a part of this family, and that they've been given and surrendered to God. And so here there's the chimes that you might hear in the background. There's these pretty flowers and things like that, but chimes and flowers and all of that, it doesn't take away the sting of death. Death, it just feels so final. And as a pastor, I go to many funerals because I'm officiating at them, and I'm sure that you've been to some as well. And when you watch a casket lowered into the ground, it just seems like it's the end. And it is. Unless Jesus actually rose from the dead. Because if Jesus actually rose from the dead, that means that death has been defeated. And there's someone that knows a way. There's someone that knows a way to go beyond that, that there is a hope that goes beyond this thing that is an enemy too big for any of us to beat on our own. So the first reason why we can trust that Jesus actually did rise from the dead, the first piece of evidence is that the tomb was empty. And a lot of people will say, well, that's not that convincing because the authorities probably just came and took his body. Well, when the disciples went around and they were telling everyone Jesus had risen from the dead, if the authorities have stolen the body, they would have just pulled the body back out and said, nope, he didn't. But they didn't. They didn't even try that. And someone might say, well, if it wasn't the authorities, it was probably some grave robbers. That was a pretty common thing. But you see, the only thing that would have been of value in Jesus' tomb were the grave clothes. Back then, cloth was a very, very valuable thing. And so when Jesus, his body was embalmed, it was wrapped up similar to a mummy with like spices and things like that. And because they believed he was dead. And if he wasn't dead, then embalming sure did it. And so, but the thing is that the grave clothes were folded up. The cloth that was over his head, it was folded up and it was just lying there in the tomb when the disciples arrived and looked in. Some people might say, well, maybe it was the disciples. They came and they stole the body. But the tomb was guarded by Roman soldiers who were trained warriors who were charged unto death if they failed at their job. But the second reason is because Jesus was seen alive by his disciples after he had died. See, Jesus had appeared to people more than 11 different times, and one time he even appeared to over 500 people in one place. And now a lot of people think, oh, well, that had to be an hallucination. They were very emotional, probably. Yeah, they were probably emotional because their leader was killed, but none of them were actually expecting that he would rise from the dead. Otherwise, they would have been at the tomb at the time that he was supposed to rise. But no one was there counting down 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. No one was doing that. They were hiding away. And then when Jesus appeared to them, it was the last thing that they expected. Besides, when's the last time you heard of 500 people hallucinating the exact same thing at the exact same time? The next piece of evidence is the transformation of the disciples. After Jesus was tortured and crucified and buried, the disciples, even before he had his funeral, a lot of them missed the funeral because they were afraid the authorities were coming for them next. They were fearing for their lives. If I were them, I would have thought, well, I guess I was duped by Jesus and I'm getting out of town. But instead, they were hiding in a home, and that's when Jesus appeared to them. And it was only a few days later that these men that were so afraid to be crucified like Jesus were in the streets preaching about how Jesus was alive. And they were taking it from Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And see, it reached all the way to us and to this conversation that we're having right now. That 2,000 years ago, a few fishermen and tax collectors and pretty much nobodies from the Middle East took this message that just sounds crazy unless you'd actually seen it, crazy unless you'd actually experienced it. And it's still transforming lives today. And that's the fourth piece of evidence, is that there are over 2.4 billion Christians in the world right now that they claim to believe, and not just to think in their mind, but to have experienced that Jesus was raised from the dead. See, here's the thing. I've come to believe that Jesus is raised from the dead. And it's not just because that's a nice thing to believe. And when I look at the bricks of a memorial garden and I see all these names that I know, and people whose funerals I've presided over, people who died too young, people who went through so much pain. And yet it feels nice to have a hope, and wouldn't it just be nice if we just could have nice feelings all the time? But the evidence points to a Jesus who actually rose. And if he actually rose, there's actually hope. So Jesus, he claimed to be God. He lived like he was God. And in the face of death, he rose. The evidence points to Jesus being way more than just a nice guy or a good teacher. And this is way more than just head knowledge. When you let this evidence affect you, it turns into heart knowledge, where you can know him who is the way, him who is the truth, and him who is the life. Because that's what Jesus wants for you and for me. Life to the full and life everlasting.